Right. So let me tell you what the like. I'm gonna tell you what the post-arrest like plan for all of this is. So essentially, if you can find a cop that doesn't have any speakers, that that would be phase one. If you find one that doesn't have any speakers, the whole idea is that these tech psychos like Mopey, they'll they'll anticipate being interrogated. They'll anticipate that, and that from that they'll have a tech psycho team. Mopey will have camera eyes, and that the whole tech psycho system essentially will be facial recognitioning the cop, and that they'll want a cop that has the speakers in. And so the counter op is to bring in an interrogator that doesn't have that, or I would be able to also, but that's the whole idea, is that their plan is to essentially prevent an effective interrogation by sound torturing the interrogator. That'll be one aspect. So then, essentially, when it comes to like trial, they'll probably plan on going to a trial. And that what I like researched is that essentially they were planning on finding ways to be pushing the court system into filling the jury with people that have speakers. And then to be basically torturing that jury into a non-guilty verdict. So that's another part of their plan. And then essentially anybody that actually knows about any of this stuff pretty much would have to have speakers. The witness stand, essentially those people they'll be placed in a position of, if they tell the truth, that they'll be subjected to horrible suicide torture shit. And that then they'll basically be told in their speaker what to say. And then, essentially, they'll be pushing for a judge that has those speakers. And then they'll be torturing the judge, essentially. And then they'll be pushing for a DA to have those speakers. To be pushing a really shitty prosecution. That's that's basically what their plan is in all of this. And so essentially it's it's gonna require potentially the government to be finding people that don't have those fucking speakers, and then they're gonna have to find some way for essentially what would be victims to be able to be talking about that stuff without getting tortured. Because here's the thing about these people: when they make a victim, they basically drug them up and they outfit him with those speakers. And so these are going to be some of the variables that'll be getting in the way of this shit. And that they'll essentially be sitting there confident about their little tech hacker world that will essentially be torturing that everybody possible that they can during the trial, during the interrogation. They'll be torturing the jail staff while in jail. I mean, this is kind of like this is what their plans have always been for this stuff, and that they've spent many years on developing potential like what if scenarios and then manipulate. I mean, this is what it is. The ones around here, they target the whole judicial system and the whole law enforcement. Okay, and it's for this reason. This is, you know, right when some cop that has speakers is like, fuck it, I'm just gonna go arrest him. That is like right then, Mopey will pretty much be sitting there with a team torturing the cop. I mean, this is like why they're always like not arresting people and shit. I mean, this is the kind of shit. This is like, this is why I went around and found all the cities. Because essentially they're all like, this is what prevents like all crime is basically run through those people nowadays, and that is where there's really no course of, you know, it's like the cops would have to subject themselves to torture, victims would have to subject themselves to torture, juries would have to like subject themselves to torture, DAs, judges, all of that, just for arresting them. I mean, if you can break down, I mean, there's the whole idea is that you gotta topple them off their stupid tech psycho shit first. That's increasingly a more difficult process. Like the moment you topple one off, a whole fucking hacker world goes into a research and redevelopment of their procedures and what they do and shit to be preventing that. I mean, the only thing that they adhere, they obsessively need that tech psycho dark web system profile to be able to exist. I mean, it's built into their whole like counter off to being arrested. I mean, eventually, you know, those type of people, it's like in a prison, it would potentially get so bad if a prison is filled with the fucking sound speaker people that it might get so bad for all the guards that essentially it would be about like finding ways for them to escape just to make the sound shit turn off. So, I mean, this is where, you know, they've basically been able to. Nobody wants to go out on a limb and get tortured into suicide, and this is the exploit that they're optimizing off of. And so, I mean, there's going to be people that exist, but see, that's the whole other thing. They'll just sit around. Their whole thought is like, here they hate Lena, basically. And so then they find ways to torture somebody that Lena cares about. And so it would be theoretically, it would be a similar idea where if you were to find a cop without any speakers or something, then they would still probably sit around torturing the rest of the fucking cops. I mean, that's. And so this is where they've had 7 years or so since the tech psycho stuff got exposed and some people got busted and stuff, and then ever since then they've been obsessively fixing the stuff that they do to prevent arrests. I mean, that's kind of like what they've always tried and done. And then when they were on Silk Road and shit, it was essentially like that. But years have gone by with a lot more intellectual development put into the resistance stuff and the punishment of people. I mean, this is like, you know, in the South, they like run away to like some pedophile church compound, basically, out of a, well, I forget where it is, but it's like when I was in Augusta, they had this church that was like picking people up at the homeless shelter and then taking them a few hours north or something to some repurposed like motor inn that's a church now or something. And then they would have to go around soliciting donations for the church as like a door-to-door salesman or something like that. Okay, so that is where when they go to those kind of compounds, that's where in the South the white supremacy was just shooting them because of that shit, basically. And that is where, you know, the legal path, you know, the legal path is going to be like, you know, the whole idea is that they wouldn't necessarily do that in the South, that they weren't doing that shit and inoculating themselves in these ways. Normally they'd be able to push them right into a prison, you know. And so nowadays they've spent a whole lot of time and effort on changing the ways that you approach all of the stuff. And so this is like where I found these Mormons or whatever being like, these tech wizards are just such a problem. And so they didn't quite comprehend what that stuff even means. So it's like, you know, what they were talking about is basically what I'm talking about. But that they kind of got things a little ass backwards on what that term represents. And that is like, you know, they'll be building a blackmail house of cards also. That's the other thing. They'll be building a blackmail house of cards that will basically be exposing the whole world and shit that they sit on top of and stuff. So I mean, these are the problems, and these are what stands in the way of what would normally be probably in the past, and probably the stuff that I said would have been enough for these cops in this town to be walking in and arresting him. I mean, that is so. I don't know. Essentially, you know, if they fuck up too bad as Tech Psycho, then the rest of their little weird coven kind of abandons them. So, essentially, probably the focus is getting them toppled off their Mormon horse is kind of what they would refer it to as because they do an S&M called Mormon Twilight. And like that is where the Tech Psycho and Mormon Twilight essentially is on like a more, they call it being on a Mormon horse. Okay? And so the approach to these people, I mean, there's a dumb way. Then it's going to have to be a sophisticated, caveated methodology. Because essentially, you know, if you, like I said, if you arrest them while they're on their Mormon horse, this would be like even other people, they sit on a Mormon horse. that it's built to basically be preventing arrest in all full kind of circle ways. And so that is where there's a lot of like development in preventing arrest of people, and that stuff has only gotten worse over the last 7 years, to where essentially everybody on dark web that was doing anything really bad is essentially doing all the stuff that it takes to be getting Mormon horse and Mormon twilight, okay? For these reasons. And so that is what, this is, I mean, these are the reasons why these cities are getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. It's like everything is like massively counter-opted to, and that it doesn't necessarily, I mean, every time that they figure out something, it's like even toppling them up. There'll be a whole dedicated fucking world that will attempt to be figuring out what course of events and shit led to a topple off. And then that becomes a new revision to the tech psycho method. And then whatever they figure out on how to diffuse one becomes counter-opted to the next time somebody emerges, or the ones that exist start doing something differently. And that is like where over 7 years of that now has really made a very hardened system. Like even more hard. I mean, this is why they get blatant, because he's probably still just sitting over there being blatant in front of everybody all the time. And so that is kind of where, the whole idea is that he's supposed to come up to his master. And so that's one of the things that they wouldn't necessarily want to do, because what that means is they have to be a master to do those tech psycho systems. And one of the things that they all suffer from is that somewhere in the world is a master over them. And that they essentially they have to beg their master to be shoving the master's dick in their mouth. And due to the fact that they do like an extreme authentic form of Satanism, more than likely that master would be the one person that they would fucking hate the most. Because when you do extreme authentic forms of Satanism, essentially sadism, Satanism becomes an integral part of that authentic Satanism shit. And so that would be a very difficult thing for them to counter up to, because essentially the rules are that they have to be mastered by their master. And so the longer they avoid that shit, that will potentially be something that might be exploitable in all of this. Because, they don't necessarily if somebody runs into their house just randomly out of an S&M and just shoves their dick in their mouth, that's not necessarily that's not necessarily mastering, because they have a very true master that they have to essentially submit to every year. And if they don't do that, then essentially they're not following their authentic rules of Satanism that somewhat governs their tech psychosystems. And so that is essentially like where the witches, if they're using those, then it'll probably be like the man that they love the most. And that's kind of the difference. Like, you'll know a real wizard master because if stupid little mopey tech psychos hate the guy, and if all the little witchies love the guy, then that's probably an indicator of who the master is. And in the end, it's the master's choice if you get a brain.